People reportedly turned so dark that it was difficult to distinguish white people from people of color. For this reason, the flu picked up the nickname the Blue Death, and many wondered if the Black Death had returned. When people began turning blue, doctors knew they wouldn't survive more than a few hours. The flu was also terrifying because it could kill so quickly. Many victims died within a day or two, or even hours of showing their first symptoms. According to a story recounted in the book The Great Influenza, a man in Cape Town, South Africa boarded a streetcar just as the conductor died. During the 3-mile ride to his house, 6 more people on the streetcar died. When the driver died, he got off the streetcar and walked home. We've had a number of cases where people were perfectly healthy and died within 12 hours. Charles Edward Winslow, epidemiologist and professor at Yale University. In late summer of 1918, the flu virus returned to America, but this time it was far more deadly. In August, a ship full of sick people arrived in New York City from Europe. 4 men had already died at sea, and 200 more people on the ship were sick. Many were taken to hospitals, but they weren't quarantined. In the following week, several more ships full of sick people arrived. The same was happening in other deep-water ports, like Boston, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. At the same time as the virus was arriving and spreading in ports, ships left those same ports headed for Canada, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, carrying infected people. In early September, there was an outbreak at Navy Pier in Boston. The pier was quarantined, but officers still moved between bases. An officer was probably responsible for carrying the flu to nearby Camp Devens. At first, just a few men reported sick, and then within only a few days an epidemic broke out. By mid-September, thousands of men were sick, in many cases violently so. Of those who were sick, 75% were so ill they had to be hospitalized. The sheer number of patients overwhelmed the medical staff at the military hospital. The hospital had been designed to treat a maximum of 1,200 troops at one time, yet more than 6,000 patients were crammed in. Cots were stuffed into every available space, in hallways and offices, even on outdoor porches. The doctors and nurses fell ill. There were simply not enough healthy people to care for the thousands of sick people. So many died that they couldn't all fit in the hospital morgue. The dead were stacked up one on top of another, like firewood in the hallway outside the morgue. Every day they were carted away, and every day the hall filled up again. The Army medical officers issued an order that no men should be sent to or shipped out of Camp Devens. However, that's not what happened. A group of officers left Camp Devens, headed to Camp Grant in Illinois. Despite the rules against it, the chief officer there had authorized overcrowding due to a shortage in barracks, once again giving the ideal environment for the disease to spread. Shortly after arriving, the officers from Camp Devens became sick. The men were quarantined, but it was already too late. Within 2 days of the first cases, the flu was widespread throughout the camp. Within 4 days of the first case, men started dying. Within 5 days, doctors and nurses became sick and started dying. By 6 days, there were 4,000 men admitted to the hospital, and they converted 10 barracks into temporary hospitals. By 7 days, they were running out of medicine, disinfectant, and other medical supplies. By 9 days, they converted 9 more barracks to serve as hospitals, bringing the number up to 20. They didn't have enough beds, sheets, or ambulances to carry all the infirm. When they ran out of beds, soldiers were ordered to stuff straw into sacks to use as mattresses for the sick. They still didn't have enough. They tried to make enough face cloths to cover people's mouths to fight the spread of germs, but they ran out of cloth. The Red Cross set up a station to notify relatives that their loved ones were dying or dead. Now relatives poured into the midst of a deadly epidemic. Healthy relatives were escorted by coughing service members to identify dead bodies in the morgue. They crowded into the overfilled hospitals to visit ill loved ones. Desperate parents and wives tried to bribe nurses and orderlies to give special care to their soldier. It became such a problem that the head officer issued a warning about accepting bribes. Those relatives would leave the camp and carry the infection out into the civilian community, into local towns, onto cross-country trains, and ultimately back to their own hometowns. Civilian health officials called for an emergency quarantine of Camp Grant, but the virus was already out. 4 days after the first reported case, a trainload of troops had left Camp Grant to go cross-country to Camp Hancock near Augusta, Georgia. For the journey of almost 1,000 miles, the men were packed tightly into train cars with poor ventilation. In the tight quarters, men coughed, became feverish, and began bleeding from their eyes and ears. They infected each other swiftly, and the virus swept along the train. The train stopped repeatedly along the journey to refuel, and the men who could still walk got off the train to get a break from the hacking coughs of the sick and delirious men. There they interacted with railroad workers and curious locals who had come to see the troops. They infected town after town for almost 1,000 miles. When they finally arrived in Georgia, 2,000 of the 3,000 men were so sick they needed to be hospitalized immediately. They started a new outbreak at Camp Hancock. Historians don't know how many of the men from the train died, but one report from Fort Leonard Wood claims 10%. Yet when hundreds began dying, the medical staff at the hospital stopped keeping careful records. They were just too overwhelmed by all the dead. One robust person showed the first symptoms at 4:00 p.m. and died by 10:00 a.m. The Journal of the American Medical Association. The same thing would happen at bases across America. At Camp Custer in Michigan, 2,800 troops reported sick in a single day. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of troops were still shipping out to Europe. By this point, the government knew how dangerous the flu was, so they had tried to contain the virus on ships. Visibly sick men were not allowed on the ships, but this didn't make much difference in the end. The flu virus incubates for a few days before any signs of infection are visible. On board the ships, the men were locked into their bunk rooms for most of the voyage across the sea, and armed military police enforced the segregation. On most ships, about 400 men were locked into each crowded bunk room in cramped quarters with little ventilation. Although the troops were segregated from others in the ship, they still shared the same mess hall where they all ate. They would file through, breathing the same air and touching the same tables and chairs as the group before. On one ship, called the 𝚅𝚘𝚗𝚘, the flu broke out almost immediately, despite the quarantine efforts. Within 2 days, it had overwhelmed the ship's medical services. The doctors and nurses were laid up sick alongside their patients, delirious, coughing, and blood pouring from their bodies. The blood pooled on the floor, and the nurses, who were still well enough to work, walked through the puddles, leaving bloody footprints on the deck. Finally, there were so many sick men that they began laying them on the deck of the ship out in the elements. They even lay there in storms, because the well were too overwhelmed to move them, and the ill were too sick to move themselves. At first, the deaths came spaced apart, and the officers took careful notes in the captain's log of the 𝚅𝚘𝚗. At first, they wrote the date and time of death, the name and rank of the deceased, their unit and cause of death. But only 1 week after leaving New York, the officers were so overwhelmed they wrote only name and time of death. The captain's log shows 2 deaths at 2 a.m., 1 at 2:02 a.m., 2 at 2:15 a.m. It continued like that around the clock. The healthy must have been terrified, locked onto a ship filled with a deadly plague with nowhere to escape. They began burying men at sea. At first they were solemn ceremonies, but after so many, the funerals became routine. They would read a name, say a brief prayer, and slide the body off the boat, then on to the next. The same was happening in every boat carrying troops across the ocean. Medical advisors begged the military to stop the troop movements, but the war machine needed men. At the same time, it was infecting the civilian population from port to port and along the railway lines. However, the very worst outbreak probably occurred in Philadelphia, and it was made immeasurably worse by mismanagement by leaders who ignored warnings from public health doctors. Had public health measures been implemented, perhaps much of the death and suffering could have been avoided. Philadelphia in 1918 was teeming with people. Hundreds of thousands had swarmed the city because of the new job opportunities working at steel plants, docks, railroad yards, and industries that supplied the war. Without enough housing for the influx, poor people were crowded into squalid, filthy slums that lacked indoor plumbing. Multiple families would cram into one apartment and share an outhouse in an alleyway with hundreds of people. Sometimes people shared not only apartments but beds, even sleeping in shifts. The boarding houses would rent out beds for 6 or 8 hours at a time. When one worker woke up to go to work, another worker would get into the newly vacated bed and sleep, same sheets and all. The streets were notoriously filthy, with rat infestations and gutters filled with trash, animal, and even human feces. With people living in overcrowded conditions, exhausted from hard labor and weak from poor nutrition, dirty water and bad air quality, it was a perfect breeding ground for an epidemic. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. Children's jump roping song, 1918. A ship full of 6 sailors arrived into the Philadelphia Navy Yard in mid-September. Within a few days, the Navy hospital was overrun, and the Navy began sending sailors to civilian hospitals in the city. As sailors began dying, the flu spread to civilians. 2 days after the first sailor arrived at the hospital, multiple doctors and nurses felt fine as they started their shifts, yet collapsed and became desperately ill within hours. However, the health board for the city didn't want people to panic. They downplayed the severity of the disease. After the death of several sailors and civilians, the health board confidently declared the disease had reached its zenith and already begun to decline. It hadn't even gotten started. At the same time, the federal government was desperate for money from war bonds to fund the war. People would buy bonds, essentially loaning the government money for a promise of being paid back later with interest. Every city had a quota of bonds they had to sell, and Philadelphia was ready to hold the Liberty Loan Parade to sell war bonds. Public health doctors begged the city to cancel the parade, terrified that it would cause the outbreak to become an epidemic. The city government ignored them. On September 28th, hundreds of thousands of people jammed into the downtown streets to watch the parade. In that huddled crowd, all crushed together, it only took a few coughing, sneezing people to launch the epidemic. Within 76 hours, just 3 days later, the city's 31 hospitals had run out of bed space. They were completely full. Some hospitals tried to cram in more by laying patients on cots in the hallways, in offices, and on balconies. In some cases, the sick were laid on the floor next to a dying patient. Once the patient died, the body was taken away, and the new patient would be lifted into the same bed, still warm from the previous occupant. The city opened several temporary emergency hospitals, but it wasn't enough. Hospitals started refusing to accept any more patients. People lined up outside begging to be let in. Some died standing in line. Even for those who got in, care was non-existent for most people. The hospitals ran out of medicine. The doctors and nurses were overtaxed, and they were dropping from the flu. They were desperate for help. People with no medical training volunteered. Physicians and nurses came out of retirement. Medical schools closed, and first-year medical students were put in charge of an entire floor of a hospital. One medical student reported that during the height of the outbreak, 1/4 of all the patients in the hospital died every day. Nurses were so overtaxed, they began adding toe tags to the living so they could tag several at once. Once a patient turned blue, it was only a matter of hours to death, so they felt confident in tagging them. Sometimes there wasn't any time for any intervention. Some people died within 24 hours of contracting the flu. A nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital started her shift in the morning and suddenly fell ill. She died 12 hours after first feeling sick. The number of dead kept growing. 5 days after the city held the Liberty Loan Parade, city leaders finally acted. The health department banned all public meetings. Churches, schools, and theaters were closed. They left the bars open, but those too were closed the next day. The courts closed and city services shut down. It took only a few days for the city's operations to completely grind to a halt. Within just 10 days, Philadelphia went from a few hundred cases of flu and a couple deaths per day to hundreds of thousands of people sick and hundreds dying every day, all because they ignored public health guidelines. By 3 weeks after the parade, the death toll stood at 4,500. So many died that they couldn't be buried fast enough. Gravediggers were sick or refused to bury flu victims. The bodies started piling up inside morgues and funeral homes. Some undertakers raised their prices 500% to try and cash in. Most ran out of coffins. One funeral home that hadn't run out hired guards because people were trying to steal the coffins. People began wrapping their dead in blankets or sewing together flour sacks to use as shrouds. No one came to take the bodies, and there was nowhere to bring them, so the dead stayed in the homes. People wrapped them in blankets and set them in closed-off rooms. The bodies were laid on porches or stacked in back alleys. In the poor, overcrowded tenement houses where multiple families lived in one apartment, there were no porches or spare rooms to put the bodies. They set them in the corners or stacked them in the alleyways next to the shared outhouses and drinking water pumps. Sometimes people were so sick that the person in bed next to them would die, and they couldn't gather the strength to take the body away. The city began to smell, the stench of death hanging heavily in the air. Finally, families began digging their own graves to bury their dead. Everyone was terrified. People avoided each other. There were cases of children whose parents got sick, and the children starved because no one would go near them in case the child was sick. This was particularly a problem since those who were most likely to die were people aged between 20 to 40, many of them parents. People couldn't get food because no trucks were delivering goods in the city. The streets fell silent. Every business was closed. People hid inside their homes. The streetcars stopped. The police cars stopped. The entire city ceased to function. You were constantly afraid. You were afraid because you saw so much death around you. You were surrounded by death. When each day dawned, you didn't know whether you would be there when the sun set that day. It wiped out entire families from the time that the day began in the morning to bedtime at night. There wasn't any single soul left. William Sardo, Washington, D.C. The Philadelphia city government was by now non-functional. Wealthy Philadelphia families appealed to the federal government for help, but there was no help to send. Cities all across America were buckling beneath the weight of the epidemic, and the federal government was busy managing the outbreak on military bases and among troops in Europe. With the city government failing to act, the women of elite Philadelphia families, many of the same who had organized the Liberty Loan Parade, banded together to start outreach efforts. They gathered together civic leaders from across the city to start planning. They set up a special hotline to answer questions about the flu, but had a hard time keeping it staffed because so many employees were sick. They set up local neighborhood leaders who would organize distribution of food and medical care. They set up soup kitchens in the schools and food delivery to sick people when possible. 500 people volunteered their cars to be used as ambulances and to deliver food and drive doctors around to treat the sick. However, there was a desperate need for more volunteers, and most people were too afraid to get involved. Leaders begged for more help, but people turned away. The fabric of society began to break down. City leaders who hadn't bothered to attend meetings of the outreach effort finally got involved. They seized the city's emergency fund to pay for supplies and pay health workers. They opened additional morgues and sent out policemen to try and clear the piled-up bodies. Like the ancient plagues, people carried their dead out to the streets. There the bodies were loaded onto open trucks or horse-drawn wagons. There were no coffins, so they stacked them one on top of the other. Also, like in the days of the plague, they stopped trying to bury people individually and began digging mass graves where hundreds of bodies were dumped in. The city used construction equipment to dig long trenches and push the bodies in. Someone would stand by the trench, say a prayer, and then the steam shovels would push dirt over the piles of bodies. By late October, the epidemic was finally beginning to loosen its death grip on the city. In its aftermath, it left a death toll of 13,000. It also left thousands of orphaned children, a shortage of food and goods, and a stalled city that had to slowly grind its most basic services back into motion. Finally, it left a changed people, filled with fear, wearied by war and disease, and crushed by grief. The people of Phoenix are facing a crisis. Almost every home in the city has been stricken with the plague. Arizona Republican, November 8, 1918. In other cities and towns across America, the news was the same. In New York City, 33,000 people died before the statisticians stopped counting. Some small towns tried to keep the virus out by quarantining themselves. They shut down all businesses and canceled public gatherings. People were ordered to stay in their homes and not touch or visit others. Some towns made it illegal to shake hands. In other towns, police were dispatched to nail signs on the doors of homes where people were sick. The signs said, "Influenza," in red letters. Rumors spread in Phoenix, Arizona, that dogs spread the disease. Policemen killed dogs in the streets, and people killed their own pets. Towns in Colorado set up barricades on the roads, and men guarded them with shotguns, preventing anyone from coming in. Other towns couldn't stop the trains from rolling through on their local platforms, but they refused to let anyone step off the trains. Anyone who did was thrown in prison and quarantined. It didn't work. The virus still slipped in. The only place that escaped the worst of the wrath was San Francisco. and historians credit that to aggressive response by the local government, who listened to their public health officials. Public Health Director William Hassler quarantined all naval stations before they had any reported cases. He knew it was only a matter of time.